And welcome everyone to another one of our book events. This is Busboys and Poets Books. We are so honored today to have with us Chuck Collins. He is a senior scholar at the Institute of Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., that I'm a member of as well, of the board. Chuck directs the program on inequality and the common good. He's also co-founder of Wealth for Common Good. He is an expert on economic inequality in the U.S. and has pioneered efforts to bring together investors and business leaders to speak out publicly against corporate practices and economic policies that increase economic inequality. He has written several books, including Born and Third Base, Wealth and the Common Good, which he co-wrote with Bill Gates Sr., and his latest, the one we're talking about today, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions. Welcome, Chuck. It's good to see you.
Great to see you, Andy. Thanks for having me across the transom here.
Exactly. I miss the days where we can be face to face and eye to eye and hear the conversations and have a glass of wine and dinner or whatever. But this is the next best thing for the time being. We hope to get back to some kind of normal sometime soon. I was going to ask you, the idea of this book, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions. It sounds like a pretty good investment, actually. So tell me about, why is that a problem?
Well, the basic problem is the wealthiest people on the planet are hiding trillions of dollars. An estimate 25 to 36 trillion dollars of private wealth hidden offshore and in trusts and other mechanisms. And so when they do that, they basically are shifting responsibilities for taxes onto the rest of us. They're making us pay the bill and they're dodging their taxes. So that's the big overarching issue.
So you come from one of the probably best known families that most Americans know, Oscar Mayer. I think most people remember the jingles. We've heard them when we were growing up. Certainly I do. I wish I was an Oscar Mayer wiener, and all of that. And you're the grandson of the founder of Oscar Mayer. Is that correct?
Great grandson, yeah.
You're the great grandson.
I hope that Busboys and Poets can create a jingle anywhere as good as that earworm.
That's right. A jingle that can last generations. It's pretty amazing. So what was it like growing up in your household? And I want to see your journey. You went from, being, of course, the top 0.001% to where you are today, where you talk about against that kind of hoarding of wealth. Can you speak to us about your upbringing as a child?
Sure. I mean, I grew up in a wealthy suburb of Detroit. I was 7 years old in 1967 when there was an uprising in the city, and it actually made an impression on me because I was trying to understand what was happening. But I lived in really a suburban bubble. And I think that the thing that was relevant to this book is I got a front row seat in how wealthy families think about the importance of passing money on to their children, and how there are these trusted advisors around, family attorneys and trust officers, who basically are like the financial butlers when it comes to helping with that transmission of wealth. So at a fairly, young age, I got a little front row insight into how that system works.
So why did you see that as a problem, and how was your journey to get away from that? What happened?
Well, I do think that what happened in 1967 planted a seed in my experience, and I really believe that the gap between suburb and city, the racial wealth divide, I could sort of see it very viscerally.
Yeah. And
I think that informed me. And then I think as I grew older, I just began to understand the nature of inequality and the gap between the rich and poor. And I also saw how inherited wealth or wealth dynasties were actually bad for, I think they're bad for children, and they're also bad for society. And I didn't really want to have any part of it. And I was very involved with the Catholic worker movement, Dorothy Day, and people who are trying to think about justice at a very different level. And so that very much informed my, I guess, rejection of that upbringing or experience. There are a lot of obviously great things about it, and I appreciate my family and the opportunities I had. But at a certain point, I wanted to kind of try to make my own way.
Are you one of many grandchildren, or great grandchildren, I should say?
Yeah, I mean, in my generation, there's probably 100 of us, so I'm not the sole.
Are you the outlier in your perspective on this?
I have some wonderful cousins who are, also, approaching the winning the lottery at birth in very creative ways. So I don't feel entirely alone and an outlier, and I'm still very connected to my family. They understand I'm the quirky one, but that's, and I should say, I made a decision to give up the money I had at that point, but there's so much other advantage that when you just are part of a multi-generational family that has access to property and financial literacy and free college, which is a huge advantage. I think, the money is only part of the bundle, if you will, the bundle of advantages that come my way.
Exactly. Now, when you say you gave up the money, is it okay to ask how much, and how did you give it up?
It was about $500,000 in 1986, whatever that's worth today. And I gave it to a number of family foundations. I gave it to 4 social change foundations.
What would that be equivalent to right now?
I think somebody told me if I just left it in the stock market, it'd be worth 6 or 7, maybe 8 million today. But it's doing its work in another place. It's working, the Haymarket People's Fund, the Fund for Southern Communities, and there was a fund that was. I didn't really make the micro decisions about where the money went. I gave it to some social change foundations, and those activist boards made the decisions. So I sort of gave up the money, but I also gave up the power of how to use it. And again, it's, to me, it's been, in my 20s, I worked with low-income tenants. I worked a lot in DC with Muscle and groups that were working with tenants to buy their apartment buildings when they came up for sale. And that work really informed, the decisions that I made later.
The book really centers around something you refer to as the wealth defense industry. And you talk about that a lot. Describe to the listeners, what is this industry? When you say wealth defense industry, it's accountants, it's professionals, it's financial advisors, it's people who help wealthy people shelter their wealth. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think it's useful to think of them almost like a class that aids the very wealthy. And when I mean very wealthy, I'm talking about the top 1/10 of 1%, people with $30 million or more. They're in the position to employ this wealth defense industry. And there's a sociologist, Jeffrey Winters, who writes about oligarchy. And he says, look, the difference between very rich and an oligarch is oligarchs invest in wealth defense, and they invest in lobbying to defend and expand their wealth. So they use their wealth to rig the rules to get more wealth and power. And that's sort of the cutoff. And so this wealth defense industry, they're tax attorneys and accountants, and they wake up every morning and say, how do I preserve this wealth? How do I sequester it, keep it from being taxed? And how do I pass on as much as possible to the next generation? That is their core mission of their work.
I know I had a few months ago, we had Anand Giridharadas on our show. He talks about the philanthropy industrial complex, basically. And also that is another way that wealthy people preserve their power and their wealth, right? I mean, so this is like a different angle, right? So one angle is sort of like to cover up the wealth by giving little morsels here and there to quiet down the masses. And the other way is to have an army of accountants and professionals who are able to then shelter that money. So it's like a 1-2 kind of impact.
Absolutely, they are complementary, and in fact, a lot of very wealthy families form family offices which oversee all these activities, including the charitable giving. And for some of these families, the family foundation is an extension of their power and influence. And let's not forget, it's a taxpayer subsidized form of private power. So for under our tax system, the wealthy people get a tax break. The wealthier you are, the bigger your tax break. And so for every dollar that a billionaire gives to charity, you and I, the rest of us, chip in up to 74 cents in lost tax revenue. So they sequester it and warehouse it in much the same way. There's that capital preservation mentality that operates in both of these spheres. Not entirely for everybody. Occasionally you hear about somebody who's giving away substantial, wealth, but the norm, because of these advisors whispering in everyone's ear, the norm is accumulate, warehouse, give away as little as possible, preserve it for the future.
Right, and you talk about these family offices. You said I think there's over 10,000 of them that basically are there to preserve the wealth, and part of it is also to give away some of it. Again, speaking to Anand's perspective, right, to sort of cover up some of that wealth in a sense, sort of whitewash the wealth.
Yeah, and actually at the Institute for Policy Studies, we have a whole project. We call it the Charity Reform Initiative, which is how do you protect the nonprofit sector from these democracy distorting concentrations of wealth that are more and more dominating charity and philanthropy. And we've actually made the case during the pandemic that Congress should mandate a doubling of the foundation payout, like move more money out of these big warehouses of charitable wealth and move it to groups on the front lines, helping people.
I mean, yeah, many of these nonprofits get money from, of course, the people you're talking about who are hoarding the money and giving some of it so that they continue to hoard even more. So how do you break that cycle? How do you break the cycle of that? I know you mentioned like change some of the laws so that more money goes out, but there's still a lot of money there. And, I mean, foundations can be changed, and you don't have to have a foundation to do that. You can do it in a different way. So how do you break that cycle of dependency on these types of organizations?
I mean, one of the things is just to have the conversation you and I are having and to remind ourselves, philanthropy is often a distraction, a deflection. It kind of keeps us from paying attention to the really deep underlying problems. So it's worth just stating, philanthropy can do some things well, but it's not a substitute for wealthy people paying their fair share of taxes and a, robust public sector. So one reform is simply to say, billionaires who give above a certain level, you don't get a tax break anymore. There's a cap on how much money can be given to charity and reducing your taxes. We should mandate much higher payouts. The money shouldn't be, warehoused in these foundations that are where the great grandchildren are going to be giving the money away. Let's move this money today, not discourage the warehousing of wealth. And then, I think there are examples like donor advised funds. Wealthy people use donor advised funds. They have no payout. So we should mandate that this money move to charities on the ground. And there's a whole program that we've put forward, but I think that sort of gets at it. I think there should not be this idea of a closely held private foundation where it's just a small group of family members playing God and making decisions about how to use vast amounts of treasure. That model should just probably not exist. It's one thing if it's a community foundation or it's broadly owned and has a lot of decision makers, but to just say one family gets a taxpayer subsidized giving account just doesn't make sense from a equity point of view.
Is this a worldwide phenomenon, or is it like an American thing?
It's very U.S. the way that we have created this very generous tax incentive for charitable giving. Other countries just have similar systems, but typically the perspective is we should, wealthy people should pay their taxes and government should solve these problems. And we shouldn't be, looking for this 1,000 points of light to solve problems like poverty and inequality and ecological disruption. Those are big problems. Charity is not the answer.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about realigning the way we spend our money? I mean, we spend so much money on the defense industry, defense industrial complex, which are probably a lot of these wealth hoarders. Frankly, they're people that work in that industry, as well as oil and fossil fuels and all of that. Some of it, of course, you can take a lot of that money and realign it and spend it much better. So I think sometimes you think, like in the United States, because we're not a monolithic society, we don't trust each other and we don't trust government. Everybody thinks that government is out there to rip them off. Whereas I think in other developed countries, they tend to trust government and say, the government is there for the common good. Do we have such thing as the common good here? Have we bought into that idea of the common good?
It's a pretty weak sense culturally, I think.
Yeah.
I think we would be better off in a society like the Scandinavian countries, where very high income and wealth is taxed. It's invested in ensuring there's a decent social safety net, nobody falls and becomes destitute. And there's public investments in, lifelong learning and education. And even rich people like those systems because, their children are also going to college without going into debt, and their parents have long-term health care without, so they're politically more popular. And I think that's better than having what we have, this patchwork of inefficient, social sector, you could call it, but it's completely inadequate to the task.
Yeah. You say there's a lot of wealth. Tell us a little bit about the scale of what we're talking about, and what could that do? How could that be realigned, and how would it benefit society?
Yeah, I think first thing is just to realize this has really mushroomed in the last 15 years. So as more and more wealth has flowed up to the billionaire class and that top 0.1%, they are hiring more and more of these people, and they're creating these things called dynasty trusts, where they literally put their money into a trust that will last for centuries and avoid taxes. So huge amounts of money are circumventing accountability and taxation. And think about it. If there's $36 trillion globally, probably 4 to 8 trillion of that is U.S. wealth hiding. And it's not necessarily offshore. It could be hiding in that luxury real estate property down the street from where you live, or it's hiding in New York City, or it's hiding in rural land or art or whatever. It's money that's being taken out of the commonwealth, if you will, and avoiding taxation. So, and here we're having a conversation now about, should we raise taxes on corporations? Should the rich pay more? Should we have a wealth tax? These are all things that we're very involved in at the Institute for Policy Studies. But here's the reality. None of that's going to succeed if this hidden wealth system is operating so efficiently. If the rich are basically making taxes optional, we're not going to be able to raise the revenue that we need to make the public investments in infrastructure or whatever it is we're trying to do.
Yeah, I got a note from John Cavanagh, who reminds us. John Cavanagh is the executive director of IPS, the Institute for Policy Studies, which we are both on. He says that our government spends 53% of its discretionary spending on the war budget. So that's obviously something really important to also consider. I think that's one of the mistrust about government, is the fact that the money is not being spent in ways that really help people. I wanted go ahead. I'm sorry, Chuck. You want to add to that?
Oh, I just would say, I think our political system has been captured by these big companies, and so they're able to manipulate our tax code. So even those of us who think, well, we should have a fair tax system, don't feel great about how our tax dollars are used, because these industry groups have skewed where the money goes. So I think John's point and your point is we have to both work toward a fair tax system, but we also have to struggle to have democratic control over the budget and the process, and not have a few industry groups dominate.
I think you said it very well, where they're basically the defense industrial complex is basically a money laundering a system. They get the money, they spend some of it on lobbying, some of it on taking ads, some of it on philanthropy, some of it on this, and therefore they continue to bring in that spigot of money that's never ending. And then we make deals with foreign countries where we give them an X amount of dollars, but they have to spend it on the defense contractors in this country. And so it's really
Right.
like the perfect money laundering scheme. It's
Yeah,
pretty phenomenal, really.
It is. That you do actually see there's sort of these interesting convergence points, which is the U.S. gives all this foreign aid to a certain country. It goes to their corrupt officials, and the money leaves their countries and comes back into the United States, but it comes in the form of anonymous kleptocratic capital. It's money that's been, plundered from the people in Africa or Southern Hemisphere somewhere. That wealth is coming here to the United States. This is the destination now for illicit funds. If you're trying to hide the money you've stolen from your people, you bring it to the United States.
Oh, let's talk a little bit about how this money is sheltered. I know that there are trusts, there are shell companies, there are places like the state of Delaware, which has become sort of a depot, really an onshore depot for those types of shell companies that people create. I know, Delaware is like you can create an LLC in 15 seconds and suddenly you're off running with whatever you want. And there's not a lot of really strict oversight over some of these shell companies. Tell us a little bit how that works.
Yeah, I've actually lately been saying it's easier to create an anonymous shell company in Delaware than it is to register to vote in Georgia under the new law. But let's just say, you've come to me, Andy. You've been quite successful. You have $1 billion. So now I'm your wealth defense advisor. Here's what I'm going to tell you to do. I'm going to say, Andy, let's take a big chunk of that, and we'll put it into a variety of anonymous shell companies, and we'll put some of that offshore. We'll put some in the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands, and we'll run a bunch of bank accounts there. But then we'll bring some of that money back in, and we'll spread it around. We'll get you some luxury condominiums. Oh, and the other thing is we'll avoid inheritance taxes so that your children and grandchildren never have to pay taxes. So we will create a dynasty trust in South Dakota that will exist for centuries, and you'll never have to pay any taxes on that money. And probably we're going to put a bunch of different layers of these ownership. We're going to create a bunch of phony transactions between one of your companies here and one of your companies here. And so we'll game the tax system in that way. And that's the game. In the wealth defense industry, what we sell is complexity. We sell secrecy, complexity, and we sell our services of fending off oversight. And that's how we're going to basically help you stash your cash and minimize your responsibilities to pay taxes.
Now, on the other hand, if you ask those folks in the wealth defense industry, they will tell you they're actually helping their clients obey the law. They're making sure that things are all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed. They're not breaking the law. This is the law, and you work within it. I mean, Donald Trump said it very well. He paid what, $750 in taxes, I think, or something. And he says, I'm not sure. I don't think he was obeying the law, but he said, I'm obeying the law. I'm just using what's there available for me to be able to not have to pay as much taxes as I am required to. So, that I should, or whatever. So how do you explain that? How do you tell those folks that they need to be just ethical and do it? I mean, their job is to shelter. Their job is to follow the law and shelter money. What is? How do you get around?
Yeah, I mean, they'll all tell you, "Oh, we're just obeying the law." But what I try to show in the Wealth Hoarders is they rig the law. They're actively involved in creating and lobbying for law. Like some of these wealthy dynastic families, the Mars Candy family, they lobbied to abolish the inheritance tax in Virginia. They literally put the money up to change the laws. These wealth defense advisors are involved in creating new loopholes and transactions. They are like dancing along the boundary of the law. And then they spend a lot of time discouraging and fending off oversight. You know, it's not a coincidence right now that the Internal Revenue Service has been decimated in its ability to oversee and audit rich people. That was entirely intentional. And the wealth defense industry has been part of lobbying for the defunding and weakening of oversight. You know, there's always going to be cops and robbers. There's always going to be people breaking the law. There's nobody overseeing the system, then these folks are just going to manipulate it as far as they can.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of questions are coming in asking about the way forward. We understand the problem. It's there. There's a huge gap of how much people are supposed to pay and how much they are paying. Money is being sheltered. It's robbing the treasury of much needed funds for many social services. But before we get to solutions, I want to talk a little bit about the pandemic that we just went through. How does that play into it? What would have happened had we not had the situation that we have, where the wealth is being sheltered and hidden and all that? How would things been different?
Well, I think 40 years of growing inequality was the pre-existing condition going into the pandemic. You had growing numbers of people who were in, precarious economic circumstances, no financial reserves, no assets, nothing to fall back on. And these tended to be the frontline workers of color who, were the most vulnerable during the pandemic. And then on the other hand, you had these super wealthy, and we've been tracking the wealth of the billionaires. The 660 billionaires in the United States have seen their wealth go up $1.3 trillion since the beginning of the pandemic. I think the hiding of wealth and the disinvestment by the rich in paying their taxes made our society ill-prepared, more fragile, more vulnerable to the pandemic conditions. And now we know, and we've been monitoring this, that wealthy people are they know that the bill is going to come due, right? They're like somebody who came to the Busboys and Busboys and Poets and had, a big party and had 20 people, and now they're trying to slip out the back door before the bill comes due. That's the wealthy people in the United States. They're moving their money into these trusts at an accelerated pace because they know people want to tax the wealthy. They want to change the laws and restore the fairness of the tax code that maybe existed 60, 70 years ago. So that's one of the ways in which the pandemic is playing out. We become more unequal, and the rich are trying to pull away even further.
You mentioned that there are we always bring up the Scandinavian countries as an example of a more egalitarian society. What countries specifically are doing this much better than the United States? Is it every country is doing it better? It sounds like we're talking about developed countries, or is it something that other countries are shifting toward the United States model as opposed to the other way?
Well, in terms of the sort of having a more equitable society, yeah, I think the Denmark, Sweden, Finland, the Nordic countries are good examples of that. Canada does better. Most of the European countries do better in terms of having a social safety net. One interesting thing happened, Andy, remember 5 years ago, the Panama Papers came out, and that exposed, one law firm in Panama, hundreds of thousands of shell companies. That really hit Europe harder than the US, meaning, UK Prime Minister David Cameron was implicated. The president of Iceland had to resign, and those countries then started to work to implement transparency and better laws around illicit funds. Meanwhile, the US didn't do anything. We were like the laggards. So now, instead of taking your money to London, you're bringing it here to the U.S. Or, if you're stealing money from around the world, you're more likely to bring it to the U.S. So yeah, I think at this stage, most of the OECD countries are doing a better job. They still have a long way to go. We all have a long way to go to clean up and take the system down, basically, this wealth hiding system.
So let's talk about the cleanup. So somebody wrote in the comments, they said, talking about it is not going to solve it. We've heard this before. And, this has been something that we've been talking about at IPS for a long time. Sarah Anderson does great work on the wealth gap. There are other people in many different nonprofits and organizations that do this kind of work. And yet, there doesn't seem to be a stomach in our political system to move this in any effective way toward what you're talking about. So let's talk about some ideas for solutions and what can the average person do to ensure that I know that the other part, and I don't mean to talk too much, but the other part is you write in the book. I think at the last, and here's the book, by the way. One of the last chapters you have in here is an epilogue that you wrote at the graduation address to the Harvard Business School class of 2021. It's a fictional address, which I assume that they may invite you to do that. But
they still have another month to invite me. So.
Yeah, they still have another month. I was going to say. It'd be great if you could maybe read little parts of it, because I think it's really useful. But before you do that, let's talk a little bit about solutions that we can do here.
Yeah. Let me just say, in defense of the book, we haven't been having this conversation forever. I don't think people understand that there's $36 trillion of wealth hidden. I don't think that they understand that there's this wealth defense industry, which is a whole class of 90,000 plus workers in the U.S. whose job it is to sequester wealth. Yes, the wealthy have always had a separate set of rules, but and I don't think we've talked about trusts and how there's this whole world of trusts which are central to the wealth hiding agenda. So in defense of my bringing up the same old, I think this is a slightly different angle on the old issue. That said, enforcement, there's four things we can do. One is enforcement. Right now, the IRS, you're more likely to audit somebody getting their earned income credit than somebody who's using one of these complex trusts to avoid taxes. And, Ro Khanna and others have said, look, and actually part of President Biden's infrastructure bill has a whole lot more resources for enforcement. They understand the IRS's capacity to investigate these complex shenanigans has been decimated. So that's number one. Number two, corporate transparency. You talked about Delaware, Andy. Corporations in Delaware don't have to reveal who their real beneficial owners are. At the end of last year, Congress passed the Corporate Transparency Act, signed into law by President Trump, requiring corporations to disclose who their beneficial owners are to the Treasury Department. That's a big step in the right direction. And that came about because there were law enforcement people who were frustrated the way the system coddles criminals, et cetera, the wealth stealers. So there are some loopholes in that, but we need to make it stronger. And cities and towns should have the ability to know who's buying up their real estate, who's buying up Washington, D.C. We should have municipal disclosure of ownership. Those are all fights that are happening in places all over the country. 3, we should just shut down and outlaw certain trusts and tax gimmicks that only exist to avoid taxes. And Senator Sanders put forward his estate tax reform bill a couple weeks ago, and it has a bunch of provisions that do exactly that. Some of that can be done through executive orders even. So that would make a big difference. And finally, then we start to get our own U.S., clean up our own house here, if you will. Then we rejoin the UK and the European Union and other countries to implement a system of transparency across countries. And Fed Chairwoman Janet Yellen the other day said we should have a global corporate minimum income tax. That is a great idea, and that implies treaties and cooperation among countries to keep these corporations from pushing for a race to the bottom. I think this is totally doable. Yes, there may not be an appetite, but actually, if you look right now, a lot of these things are in motion. And I think it's really important for us to affirm and push and make the case to to elected officials and anybody that we should be moving in this direction to shut down this hidden wealth apparatus.
I mean, the whole idea that we've looked at corporations as people also, which is really strange. I mean, that also, I think, feeds into that idea that of hiding money and being able to get away with all kinds of stuff that a person would get away with, where a corporation should not.
No, and we're starting to see, even some corporate leaders, but basically, the system has become so porous. Mm-hmm. And on the corporate tax side, it's a joke. I mean, our friends over at the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy just did their analysis. 50 companies that have an effective corporate tax rate of less than 1%. So the Trump tax cut blew open the door, but boy, it's ridiculous. And even like Bezos and Jamie Dimon and all these people are saying, yeah, we gotta. It's kind of reminds me of 1985 when there were so many corporations that paid no taxes that it became embarrassing even for the Republicans who supposedly believe in the rule of law. So I think we're back in that moment again.
Who are the people that are defending this idea, right, of sheltering money and keeping the wealthy wealthy? I mean, you're talking. We're talking about a lot of people. We've seen this here in this country vote against their own interests, and because they think one day I might become a trillionaire and I need to be able to shelter my money as well, which is quite unlikely for most people. Who are the people that are like standing up and defending this idea? Because the number of people that are the wealthy as the top are a very tiny number of people. And I know they have undue influence, but there are people that vote. There are people that go out there and change. We still live in democracy. They can change the way the system. What will it take to educate these folks who are always voting against their own interests to say, this is bullshit? We need to stand up for what's good for us as opposed to what's good for the 0.01%.
Something interesting has happened in the last 15 years, which is, I think it used to be if you said, well, we want to tax the wealthy, you'd have people saying, no, I hope to someday be wealthy. I don't want to have those. That has changed. The Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax, 70-80% of the public supports it, including majority of Republicans. People who voted for Trump also believe the rich should pay much higher taxes.
And hers is like, if you make $10 million or more, it's ridiculously high to begin with, right?
And that's actually important. You need to be able to say, look, over $50 million, or this tax proposal is only going to be paid by people in the top 1/10 of 1%, 30 million and up. And those policies are because people know they're not going to get there. They know that the economy's been rigged by the wealthy, and that those folks are getting away with all kinds of games. And so, there is broad public support for this. There is this wealth defense industry that actively is lobbying. So yeah, you've got, the super rich and their lobbyists, but you also have this class, if you will, a whole sector that also has a lot of power in the society that's defending the system. But otherwise, this is a really popular program. And my experience is talking about this book for the last couple of weeks. People love talking about this. They are hungry to learn this, and they're angry and focused, and they want to be part of a movement to shut the system down. Mm-hmm. So I think there's broader popularity for this than we think sometimes.
Yeah, I would agree, but again, how do you educate the average person? We have someone named Titus Alexander is asking, how do you educate citizens about how this system works and how they can use to change the laws to serve the majority, not the wealthy few? I know that you talked about Elizabeth Warren's bill, to try to tax those making 30 million or more. Now, what would that do specifically? That sounds like a really not a very hard thing to pass. I mean, there's not many people that have 30 million or more, and therefore that should be an easy get, right?
Well, I mean, yeah, we have a political system that's obviously been captured, and we have one party that's goal is to block change. So obviously we're in this political moment where we have a very slim, chance of moving legislation. It has to go through this gauntlet unless we abolish the filibuster. But we are up against the capture. But the pressure, here's what I noticed: the pressure just keeps building for these changes. People are, and I think Titus is right. I think we need to say, look, there's one tax system for the richest 1/10 of 1%, or for the billionaires. Let's just say it's the billionaires, and there's another tax system for everyone else. And Titus and the rest of us get our taxes taken out of our paycheck, out of our income taxes every paycheck, whereas the rich have a separate set of rules. And all we're saying is we should eliminate these special rules that only benefit the rich. And there you have the potential for a real majority that also pulls in traditional Republicans and conservatives.
That makes sense. So what's the likelihood of something moving, let's say, the next couple of years during this administration? Is there likelihood that this stuff will become mainstream and pass, or is it going to take another several generations to get this moving?
Well, I see a pathway emerging now. Biden has proposed this infrastructure bill, doesn't go far enough on a number of things that we care about, but he wants to pay for it with closing down a lot of these corporate tax loopholes, creating an international system of cooperation around corporate taxation. That is if the US participates in that, they will have allies around the world. That could pass because everyone knows we need to make investments in infrastructure. Everyone knows these corporations are getting away with paying no taxes. The next up is taxing individual rich people. Those policies are even more popular than corporate tax policies because corporate tax policies, people say, well, that's jobs. But taxing wealth, taxing inheritances, taxing, dynastic inherited families, people are all for that. So the next round of how do we make some of these things permanent that have been passed to address poverty and inequality, tie those to taxing the very super rich. Again, popular ideas. If we keep our movements focused, if we continue to make demands that happen, you could see a year from now starting to turn the corner. And if these investments are made in enforcement, for every dollar enforcing tax dodges on the rich, we're going to bring in $10 to $20 of new revenue. We're going to have the resources to make these kind of investments. And then the rest of the world is waiting for us to come to the table to sort of be part of the international fix. So I totally see a path forward in the next 2 years. Obviously things can go badly and we can stay stuck, but I also see if we keep pushing, this could be one of those little transformative moments that periodically happen in U.S. history.
Well, we pride ourselves at Busboys and Poets that we attract the smartest and the brightest people to some of these talks and programs. And oftentimes they come to these programs and they walk away saying, well, okay, sounded really good, but I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. I don't know who to call. I don't know where the soft spot is. So can you help us with that? Can you help the average listener, the above average listener that's watching this and listening to this on our Facebook and our YouTube and all of that, to actually have a path to where they can be most effective to get this going?
Yeah, I think that there are limits to what any of us can do as solo individuals. So we do need to come together with other people to shift this. I would encourage people in this moment, check out Americans for Tax Fairness, one of a national coalition that's pushing for these conversations. There's a group called the Financial Accountability Corporate Transparency Fact Coalition that's working to make sure that these corporations, are, have to disclose what they're doing. At IPS, we have a website called inequality.org. You can sign up for our weekly newsletter, and in there we always have weekly actions, things that people can do, places to engage. But I think it's, if you're in the DC metro area, find some of the terrific activist groups at the local level, join together, be part of a larger movement, bring whatever gifts you have to that group to push for change. So I think, I just encourage people to find one another and join some of these existing efforts and help build the movements that will help fix the future.
Are there bills in Congress that people can lobby for and push for? I know that we talked about Elizabeth Warren's bill, but can we talk a little bit more specifically about what other bills there are? Because sometimes those phone calls really make a difference. And if we get people to get activated in that regard as well, aside from joining, of course, organizations and supporting the Institute for Policy Studies, and other organizations like that, are there bills, specific bills that people can lobby for?
Well, one is the Ro Khanna's Stop Tax Cheats Act, which would directly provide resources to enforce tax laws on the very wealthy. So Ro Khanna's Stop Tax Cheat Act. When you go to Americans for Tax Fairness, you'll see there's a whole bunch of pieces of tax legislation that are in process, like the wealth tax, but there's something called the millionaire surtax. There's policies that the Biden administration is putting forward that, could use more kind of people power backing them up. There's a proposal for a financial transaction tax, a Wall Street financial transaction tax. So you can find out about those at Americans for Tax Fairness and at inequality.org. I think if you're interested in charity reform, check out our campaign around what we call the emergency charity stimulus, which is to increase foundation payout during the pandemic. And you can find that at inequality.org at the Institute for Policy Studies. So there's some very specific things, and people should check out inequality.org. You'll see even more, kind of immediate individual actions people can take.
And we're putting up some of these links online. Patrick and Alicia from our team are putting them up as we get them and hear them. So before we finish, I know you wrote the commencement speech for the business school at Harvard, but I also, I went to University of Maryland Business School, Smith Business School there, and I remember having lots of arguments with the professors there. But one of the arguments was some of the professors were saying, do not work for nonprofits because that lowers the standard of the school because your pay will be much lower. And a lot of people go to business schools because they look at the salaries once you come out of business school, what you're going to make. And that really rates the school in many ways. So a lot of schools were encourage their students not to work for nonprofits making $60,000, $70,000 a year, but go for the big bucks, the 150 and above. And that was really problematic. So the system is rigged in such a way as to not really, like, it poo-poos the idea of people working for less than 150,000. That's like considered a loss for the school. So you have to change that mindset. I don't know whether that is baked in the formula that you're talking about.
No, I think one thing that I'll say is, as part of this book, I interviewed a lot of people who worked in the wealth defense industry, and a lot of them at the end of their careers said to me, "I hate what I did my entire life. Yeah. I sold my soul to the billionaire class. I thought I was helping a family, but actually I was helping one rich family at the expense of all the other families in the world. And so my message to younger people is, of course, you may have student debt, you may have responsibilities to your family, you may have to earn a certain amount to kind of lift up your family or pay back the debt or whatever. But if you can make a choice, I would say don't work for the billionaires. That's my commencement speech. There's other meaningful work. There's other meaningful work that's going to pay well. Don't work for the billionaires. Don't devote your life to the further accumulation of wealth for this small group. Work with workers to buy out their companies. There's all these companies that are coming on the market. Their owners are selling out. They're going to sell it to a private equity company. No, work with the workers to do a worker buyout of a company. Help make public agents go work for the IRS. Oversee the follow the money. Use your skills to be a forensic accountant and track down the illicit money that's destroying our communities. Work to create affordable housing. There are good paying jobs in the sector of, public finance, public oversight, and creating a social housing sector. But I would just say, just realize, don't use, as the poet Mary Oliver said, don't use this one precious life that you have been given to help the already rich get richer. That's sort of the nut of my commencement speech.
So we won't make you read it, just in case they invite you. You don't want to have to already have.
Yeah, I don't want it to be on YouTube or something.
On
yeah,
YouTube,
that would
exactly. Then people will know what you're going to say. But it's basically that, and I think it's a beautifully written speech, and I would definitely recommend to Harvard to take you as their commencement speaker for their business school. They normally would have what, Larry Summers kind of guy, or that kind of person, right? Would get up and give them the commencement speech.
It would be a billionaire. Have to be a billion. They have a hall at Harvard Business School where they have. I've gone there. Actually, Anand Giridharadas and I both spoke in this Seth Klarman Auditorium, which is this you've never seen a more beautiful public space in this business school. And you realize, all these young people are being told, you are the light of the world.
Right.
You're the smartest people in the universe. And part of my commencement is great. Use those gifts to rebuild the social fabric and rebuild the Commonwealth and reduce inequality. Be the champions of that. And there's plenty of good work to be done. Just don't work for the billionaires. Don't help them.
It's the Ivy League business schools that have really screwed up the world. Really, I mean, I think, and this is not just a flip comment, but I think it really is important to understand that once you go down a certain path, you continue down that path, it's very hard to diverge from that. And when you do, like I mentioned earlier, you are shunned. You are outside that club, and suddenly you become a pariah. And that needs to change. I don't know how that could change, because that's a real issue. Because these are people that end up to be Supreme Court justices, end up to be presidents, and end up to be heads of really big, huge multinationals, and they can make an impact. They can make a change, but they're guided in such a way. They have a one size fits all and a one mindset, and that's very hard to break.
There's a terrific sociologist named Brooke Harrington who went sort of undercover. She got a 2-year training to be a wealth manager through the Society for Trust and Estate Planners. And she then interviewed all of her peers and all these folks. She found, there's like 25% of them that are like true libertarian, anti-tax anarchists. They're just not, they're just like, no taxes. The rich are the best people in the world. We should do everything we can to help them. They are the exalted. But 25% are like, get me out of here. I'm trapped. And the other 50% are kind of like, it's a pretty good livelihood. But once their peers start to say, really, that's what you do? You get up every morning and you use your entire life force to help rich people get richer at the expense of the whole society, is that's really what you do, that will become less attractive. And those are the people, by the way, who are leaking data. The Panama Papers came because someone inside that law firm leaked hundreds of thousands of documents. And that's happening now all over the place. So all of a sudden, the hidden wealth system is starting to crack. It's cracking from within, and it's also cracking because of the pressure we're going to put on it. So, and I think part of it is talking to younger people and saying, don't go down that path. Don't say, oh, I'm just going to do this for 10 years and I'm going to bank a lot of money and then I'm going to go start my own nonprofit and save the world. No, don't go down the path, because you'll just wake up one day and you'll be just like, I'm trapped. I got a big mortgage. I'm trapped in this soul crushing anti-social occupation. So anyway, hopefully there's some people out there.
Well said. I hope you scared enough people out there to rethink, at least, and I agree. I've known many folks that have gone into farming, organic farming, because they just couldn't bear that kind of life, which is really interesting. So a final question I've asked all of my guests during these conversations is, I want you to imagine a dinner that you want to have and invite people that you'd like to, from the past, the present, the future, wherever. And you can have as many people as you want. Can you tell us who would be at your dinner? And I'll cater it.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. You prepped me for this question, but it still stumps me a little bit. But off the top of my head, I've always been intrigued by Leo Tolstoy. I've also, been a fan of people, of Maya Angelou, and people who've sort of been thinking about, kind of the the poet who I mentioned. Anyway, so I think something that has sort of people who've looked at inequality from a different era, along with those of us who are looking at inequality today, sort of a cross-generational, cross-epoch dinner party. So that would be my.
Would you invite like a Jeff Bezos or a Warren Buffett or someone like that into the party?
Maybe, who I like is like people like.
Have you sat with people like that? I mean, to have a conversation with them?
Yeah, actually, like Craig Newmark, who started Craigslist. I've gotten to know him. What's fascinating is he could have grabbed all this money. He could have created this, like eBay, where people paid money to use Craigslist, but he decided to keep it in the commons, except for real estate ads. He left billions of dollars on the table, if you will. He didn't grab all that he could. So those people interest me too. The Jonas Salks of the world, who create a vaccine, but they don't patent it because it belongs to everyone. People who understand the commons, the ecological commons. So those would be some of the people I'd love to have dinner with.
Well, wonderful. I want to encourage anyone watching to buy their book at independent bookstores. Jeff Bezos does not need any more money to hoard. So buy it at independent bookstores, Busboys and Poets, of course, being one of them. And you can go in person. And I know the book is on back order because we ran out. Like, that's a pretty good. But you can buy it also on bookshop.org. Go to bookshop.org. Put Busboys and Poets, and you'll be able to go, or your favorite independent bookstore, and be able to go there, and you can buy it directly online, and it'll be shipped to you. So we encourage you to support independent local bookstores. Thank you so much, Chuck Collins. We appreciate you. Thank you so much for your book, The Wealth Hoarders. It's a great read. It's a fun read. It's right here, and it's a quick read, actually, and it'll just be a refresher of what we just talked about. But not this Friday, but next Friday, we're going to have Jamie Raskin. Congressman Jamie Raskin will be talking about everything from the impeachment on forward for what's going on, and we'll ask him about some of the ideas that you brought up, Chuck, about wealth inequality and what is being done in Congress to alleviate some of that. So again, thank you all. Until the 23rd of April. That's when we'll see you on Friday, 6 p.m. with Jamie Raskin. Until then, peace and love and all good stuff. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks, Andy.